things. What was that? Oh, that was the bell for recording. Okay, now we're recording. And let me just get my whiteboard out. And whoa, okay, my computer is not being cooperative. Hold on a second. There it is. And what am I going to do? I'm going to say present now. I'm going to present a window, and I'm going to present the whiteboard. Okie dokie. So we are at what? No. Sorry. I guess I have a case of the Mondays. All right. Let's try that again. Culture. Why is it doing this to me? All right. Culture. Stop doing that. And power. Okay. What's today's date? It's the 27th or 27th. Son of a bitch. Excuse me. I think there's something wrong with my pen here. God damn it. Okay. Culture and power 427. Let's see if this works. 20. Okay. What is fucking, excuse me. Oh, this. Wait, is a piece of. No, that doesn't look right. We'll see. Sorry. So someday I'll get used to all this, and that will be the day the semester is over. So what is that? Why did it do that? I didn't do anything. See, it's getting like a ghost thing. Like, yeah, see, that shouldn't. All right, very sorry. Shit. It's like, let me try unplugging it and plugging it back in. That's all. All right, and no, yeah. Oh, whoop. Okay. Yep, that made it better. Okay, sorry. What are we talking about? Culture, power. All right, we have. I should mention this. It's almost like because we've been doing this, been talking about culture for quite a while now. Clearly, we've touched on a good bit of the specifics and the details in somewhat different ways. Toward the end of the session today, I want to talk about sort of the deployment of culture in everyday life as an issue of power, but that's a callback to like chapter 3 or 4 even, and obviously there are more specific issues like framing that we really, kind of hashed out, I think, fairly well when we're talking about social movements. Obviously, I guess the sort of the suggestion there is that there are a huge variety of issues of culture with respect to how people deploy power. Should just reiterate, as Griswold says at the beginning of the chapter, when we talk about power, we're talking about. I guess I should write this down. Power equals getting others to do things for you that they might not otherwise do. And so I don't know if this was her example, uh, getting you a glass of water, right? If you ask your mom to get you a glass of water, that's slightly putting her out, right? That's taking time from her day that she could use do other things with. She could do other things with that time, but she gets you a glass of water because she loves you. And I don't know if any of you read like any of the love books. There were a couple of love books on the list for book reviews, but love is obviously a cultural thing. We believe that your mommy should love you, and in most cases that's a pretty soft exercise of power. To a different level, getting a driver's license. You know that if you don't have a driver's license, the state will exercise some power over you, up to and including taking you to jail if you get caught driving without one. So, you remember getting a driver's license is kind of a pain in the ass. It's not something you really want to have to do, but the state exercises power to make you do it, and at a kind of at the grossest level, you might tell people to stop demonstrating, and ultimately, that can involve shooting some of them, right? So we know that the state at times has to exercise pretty naked power. And that then gives Griswold space to discuss the means of exercising power. That last one being the example of force. I think that's pretty straightforward, right? So you shoot at people, you push them, you handcuff them, you make them do things using physical force. Exchange, clearly in a capitalistic society. And this one, I should say, already depends a bit on culture. So this is generally speaking, this is paying certainly in our modern society. That's how this works. But you should recognize that there's already a cultural framework that has to exist in order for exchange to work. You may remember at some point as children, you realized that money is as a thing, physical paper money, right, is inherently worthless, right? It's just funny pictures on paper. It's the cultural apparatus, that supports the idea that cash money is valuable, to the extent then that the Wu-Tang can say that cash rules everything around me, and of course they were correct in that assessment. Then we move though to more culturally supported, as she says, culturally supported exercises of power. And I heard a ding, so let me just check on the ding. And that is the they're not wrong, right? So yes, that's a good tattoo, actually. Okay, so the culturally supported exercise of power And that is, generally, and I think I talked a bit about this last time or the class before. The issue of legitimacy, but also morality. It's this would be the idea that it's just right to if you do things that your mom or your grandma tells you to do, you may not want to do it, but you do it because there's at least in part because there's a moral dimension to it. You've been taught that it's the right thing to do, and of course, that is anything we teach you. That's evidence that culture is at work here, and common sense. Although that's that's what do they say? Common sense is uncommon. It's a little more problematic, but I would just say, or almost put it into the type 1, type 2 cognition rubric here. Um, this is things like, I always carry my wallet, right? I've always got my driver's license with me. When I'm driving, it's automatic. I don't think about it. There are certain folk ways, certain just behavior patterns that cultures establish for us, that we in a sense, in a fairly abstract sense, by sticking my wallet in my pocket when I go out the door, that is the state exercising power over me because I know that I need to have the driver's license, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I just wanted to break down a bit momentarily. Let me pick a different color pen for this here. Legitimacy, you should know. We're coming from Max Weber now with this, especially. So those of you who have gone through my theory course, should have some grasp on this. But this is, I think, an important cultural issue and something to bear in mind about how power is exercised. And again, I'm not sure I mentioned this, but with all of these things, not again. Okay. With all of these, part of the idea is that getting away from force, getting into culturally supported exercises of power is less costly, right? If the state had to have agents who would, potentially crack your head or lock you up every time, you left the house without a driver's license or something like that, that would be, almost an unsustainable state, right? The state requires, and just people in general, if your parents had to beat you, it's a horrible thought, but if your parents had to beat you every time they wanted you to take the trash out, that's a pretty emotionally, physically costly way to get you to do things. But if they get you to buy into either the legitimacy of their power or the morality of listening to your parents, then it becomes much less costly, and people can get a lot of other things done. I just wanted to take this kind of sidebar on Weber, though, because I think it's important to consider a different sort of specification of the legitimacy of power. And again, this should be review for a few of you. Three types of legitimate authority. And we really do still work with these. You'll see lots of references to this in literature on politics and power and that sort of thing. So there's the traditional, which is like kings, and you give them power basically because it's always been that way. This king is king because his dad was the king, and his dad was king because his dad was king, and all the way back. And that's just how we do it in this society. Oops, bring me back. Still not sure why that's happening. Okay, so there's traditional authority. There is charismatic authority. Again, as we spend time watching Netflix, I don't know if you guys are watching. Well, actually, I mean, going back to Tiger King, right? You can recall there did seem to be something strangely charismatic about Joe Exotic, right? I've been watching the program about Waco, which is it's okay. It's not great, but as somebody who lived through that, I'm kind of interested to see how they break it down. But for a lot of us, the understanding is that the leader in Waco, who led a bunch of people, essentially to their deaths, was a very charismatic leader. And what that means is you give these people personality, you give these people power because you find their personality attractive or compelling in some way. With Koresh, essentially they believed he was the Messiah, but he also, he could recite the Bible backwards and forward. We're talking about special people here. And then Weber finally, in kind of the most, I guess you would call modern formation of power is rational legal authority, which grants people power based on the fact that they follow laws and procedures. When I used to talk about this in intro classes, I would show Al Gore's concession speech from 2000. In 2000, there was a great what would you call it? Well, it was a shit show, really. The election was a shit show, and it was Florida's fault because we couldn't really tell who won the election in Florida without going through multiple recounts. And eventually, the Supreme Court decided to end the recounts, and Gore, who was contesting the election against George W. Bush, eventually Gore said, okay, that's it. If the Supreme Court says it, then that's what we're going to have to do. And he says something to the effect of, I disagree with this, but this is the law. These are the procedures that we have in place, and following those procedures is really the only way that we have to settle this peacefully, shall we say? And so he did not kind of certainly resort to force or anything like that. And just generally speaking, right? We make our decisions about leaders, through voting, through following those kinds of rules. Okay, so where am I at here? All right. Then, and she kind of, there's a little bit, always with final chapters of books, there always seems to be a little bit of the kitchen sink to it here. It makes sense to bring it in, but the next thing she brings up that we should talk about, or at least have put into your toolkit, is the distinction between whether we are cultural dopes versus free agents. And one I'm sorry to do this, but one way to sort of put cultural dopes into the current rhetoric and kind of understand it politically in terms of how people submit to power is that that goofy epithet, right? Sheeple, which I don't know. I assume you've heard the term sheeple before. Wake up, sheeple. The idea, behind that really being that, if you are blindly following the powerful and listening to what they say uncritically, then you are like a sheep, right? Sheep, like a sheep. I'm sorry. It's just weird, right? One sheep is a sheep, two sheep are sheep. If you're a sheep, then you kind of blindly follow the shepherd, right? Then this is the stereotype of sheep, aren't really thinking. They're not making decisions for themselves. And we do think about this in cultural terms because what? Because if you just follow your leaders, if you just kind of go along and get along, the argument would be then that people are just entrained into doing things the way they've always been done. That they're not really thinking, and that's what free agents really do, is they critically think and they make decisions. In terms of power, I mean, you unfortunately, again, the whole era of COVID makes this, pretty stark, right? So most of us, the vast majority of society, have decided to go along, excuse me, have decided to go along with things like stay-at-home orders, that kind of thing, because, well, I guess there are two ways to argue it. Right? One is that because we're cultural dopes, right? We'll do whatever the government tells us. The other argument is that we have freely decided that given the evidence at hand, it makes a lot more sense to be cooperative members of society. We believe the scientists, and we believe that social isolation will save a lot of lives, potentially our own. So, but again, there's really the divide. Are we these free agents making those decisions, or now one of my professor friends is he teaches at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he was posting all weekend pictures of people. People who are exercising their free agency, but their critical thinking, their decision making, has led them to believe that the government is taking away their civil liberties by ordering people to stay at home, and they believe that anybody who is staying at home are sheeple, right? Are cultural dopes, and so they were protesting this order, right, as they have done in several states, as we've been talking about. Now, again, this is clearly this is in the political discourse. This is in the sociology discourse as well, though, and it really is important to consider, whether people really blindly follow power, really blindly, as they say, are cultural dopes, or whether they're free agents. Again, though, I will say, in the last 10 or 20 years, and we'll again get back to this a bit. The cognitive sociology, has introduced a lot more doubts about just what kind of free agents we could be. Okay, talking about. Did I just do that? I did. Okay. Talking about power differentials, right? So one thing we clearly know about society is that some people are more powerful than others. And, again, not sure this is the most fruitful way to do this, but Griswold talks about there being more and less arbitrary differentials in power. And in a sense, what we're saying by more or less arbitrary is that these are, I guess, purely, it's something that's totally arbitrary. Would be purely cultural. Is just purely a cultural artifact. The more arbitrary, excuse me, God, I need to power down some more of this coffee here. Okay, the more arbitrary would be things like beauty and height. Right? We do give more power to more beautiful people, to taller people. There's that stat that Griswold quotes about how tall the presidents have been, and presidents are always tall people, kind of surprisingly so. You meet somebody like Trump, Clinton, Obama, any of those guys, they're like, oh, that guy's taller than you thought he was. They're taller than they look on TV, and of course that gives you, that is this weird culturally, somewhat arbitrary thing that we give to people. We're like, oh, you're tall, you must know what the fuck you're doing. Less arbitrary would be what she says, what historically conditioned differences between ethnicities. So of course, the power differentials between people of different ethnicities are largely arbitrary. There's no there's no such thing as genetically superior or inferior or anything like that. We say it's less arbitrary though, because there is that history there, right? So there's these real power relations, for example, between African Americans and white Americans are based on a long history of whites exercising power. Um, and contemporary prejudices and stereotypes and everything are rooted in that. And then somewhere in between, well, I'm not totally certain I'm happy with this construction, but it's worth at least considering. More in between would be gender, which is obviously predicated on a long history of patriarchy, but then also which is proving to be quite mutable, and where we can see across generations, is changing arguably more rapidly than ethnicity differences. Although how close or far these would be on a scale, I think are that's an empirical problem to be discussed, to be studied. With respect to history, this is where a good deal of the sort of the sociological research on power has plied its trade, and we'll do a decent bit on that in the next couple of classes, really looking at how symbols have been deployed across history to change power dynamics or to change power relations between people. And in here, a particularly important idea is the idea of collective memory. And this is basically the memory that members of a group hold up as being, I guess, true or important. So things like and it's really it's interesting to look at in the context of history books and things like that. What we remember in our collective memory are things like George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. We don't really remember much, although times are changing. We don't really remember much about Bohemian immigrants on the frontier in the late 19th century, things like that. Right? So our collective memory kind of focuses on particular things that help to keep certain people in power positions, or as she points out, that collective memory legitimates some behaviors and delegitimates others. So, as examples, she gives perceptions of slavery. In the collective memory of African Americans, I think slavery is probably more accurately represented than it is in the majority population, or in certainly in some parts of the white population, right? Especially amongst again, what do you call them? Southern traditionalists, something like that. Where the perception of slavery in the African American community tends to be that it was not very long ago, and has real and important consequences, in contemporary life, and would justify things like calls for reparations, or it legitimates that sort of a political narrative, as opposed to oh gosh, I mean, even just how people talk about the Confederate flag, right? The Marines just had to ban the Confederate flag because apparently, some folks still want to display it on base. And their argument tends to be, oh, it's a symbol of what, of pride and states' rights and that kind of a thing. But for many folks, it's a symbol of slavery, right? Of defending a barbaric economic and human relationship. That those are differences of collective memory, and they really do come out as differences in how people exercise and or submit to power. Again, just to specify this a bit more, it is it's always constructed. So history is never, it's never a given, right? And you've heard, yeah, I mean, I guess, it's useful to repeat that old saw about, history is written by the victors. It is just more generally written by the powerful. But is also, I would say, importantly contestable. Does that make sense? Which is just to say, people fight about it. People fight about what counts as history, and sometimes that's just factual things. I'm having a hard time thinking of that. Well, I mean, with the Waco thing, for example, this is where the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, raided a religious compound cult. Part of the question, or a way to frame the question, is about who shot first. And people will be debating for some time, who shot first in that situation. Or, you get Civil War historians or World War II historians argue about, what battle was really important, that kind of thing. So there are contestations over facts. There are contestations, though, I would say maybe especially with the question of power, about what or who is important. One way to put this is who gets a statue. And obviously, as we're pulling down Confederate statues, or as people are resisting having statues of people like General Lee pulled down. That's an important site of contestation, and obviously an important statement about who we are. Do we honor those kinds of people? In a little bit less proximal a case, there are questions about who died in the Holocaust. And I don't mean, I guess I should capitalize Holocaust. I don't mean Holocaust deniers, although they are certainly, an interesting case to look at. By denying the Holocaust, you have some group of people who, I guess, are essentially defending Hitler. But even beyond that, based on your education, and most of you probably read, Wiesel's Night, that the Jews died in the Holocaust. What frequently hasn't been told, though, is how many mentally handicapped people died in the Holocaust. How many gay and lesbian people died in the Holocaust? How many we call them gypsies or Roma died in the Holocaust? And those people are really not as memorialized because they remain as marginal populations in Europe and in the U.S. Okay. So those, and these questions also, should mention, these go to things like history textbooks as well. So there are real contestations about who gets written about in history textbooks. Moving on, note that power is embodied. And here we mean things like ritual aesthetics. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of following along with how the book lays things out, but when she brings this up, she brings up DiMaggio on type 1 and type 2 thinking here. And remember, type 1 thinking is sometimes referred to as automatic. Sorry, somebody just started blasting the Dance Monkey song. That's going to be distracting. Type 1 thinking, right, is automatic. Type 2. God, all right, sorry. It's really loud here. I don't know if you can hear that. Type 2 thinking is deliberate. All right, thank God it stopped. And what does that mean with respect to power? With respect to power, I think what's important there is just to remember that we, and this is kind of hearkening back to some things mentioned earlier, that this type 1 thinking, in the submission to power, means that we really kind of unthinkingly give ourselves over to power or to following, the government or whoever, and that we are ultimately a way to sort of operationalize this, though, something you might sort of apply it to, is this is also uh, biased, or you might say knee-jerk thinking. Um, that, for example, when you see well, um, looking at how people relate to Trump's rhetoric. Um, there are two ways that people seem to get into uh, understanding the utterances of Trump. I guess that should be capitalized, right? And these basically are biases that we have developed over time, through our experience in competing political cultures. And of course, some people don't care at all, but amongst people who kind of care either way. There are people who are given to the belief that Trump is always lying, or I'm trying to think back. So you remember last week we were talking about injecting disinfectants. That's not lying. I don't know what that is. Making shit up, I guess. Making shit up on the fly. You know, there are people who have become given to thinking that everything the guy says is a lie, because that's a bias that you've developed over time, based in your particular political or speech community, or you think that he is a stable genius. And it was interesting to see, um, and folks really do believe this. It's kind of interesting to see, and again we can put it into this rhetoric of cognitive biases, or of just applying a certain kind of thought schemata. If you are given to the belief that Trump is a stable genius, then anything that comes out of his mouth is not a mistake, but is how to put it? It's a really smart thing that just hasn't been kind of completely understood yet. And so,
Or,
yeah.
or I was just gonna say, like, people will say like, "Oh, you're interpreting it wrong," or like
Yeah.
you're taking it out of context.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so there were people who were saying, like, well, the the injecting Lysol thing, it's a smart idea, but we're interpreting it wrong, or we missed some part of the of things, right? We missed what he was really meaning there when he said that. Yeah. And again, to put that in these type 1, type 2 sort of things, that's just, well, if you're given to belief in Trump, you're going to go that way. If you're given to disbelieving everything, it's going to go that way. And of course, the danger with that is that he's probably not lying all the time. He's probably not saying genius things all the time, but it's actually relatively hard to get into deliberate thinking, into like really thinking, like, well, what makes the most sense, what's really happening here. So that's one kind of embodying ritual aesthetics. I should say, as I mean, this literally means rituals. So things like commemorations. I'm sure there's a missing M in there somewhere. Commemorations. You know, we remember. What's the one that's coming up? Memorial Day, right? We remember certain wars on Memorial Day. Some of them get more or less forgotten, that kind of thing, you know. Or, you know, we commemorate fallen soldiers. We don't really commemorate, you know, we don't really celebrate May Day in America, right? We don't support the labor movement in that way. We have this thing called Labor Day, you know, at the end of August, right? But it's not really a celebration of trade unions. It's this kind of broad support of the working American. That's you know, that's a specific political choice, and again, that's an embodiment of the power relations, right? So in communist countries, they celebrated May Day, and the worker, and you know, and revolution against the capitalist and all that kind of thing, right? So that's a way of embodying it, and also we should take some account of corporeal embodiments of power, in as much as the society tells us that there is a right body, you know, and Griswold mentions anorexia here as sort of an outcome of that. You know, we celebrate thin bodies in our culture, you know, and that is an exercise, a subtle exercise of power over people, over especially women, in our society. Finally, I think finally, there are a couple other things I would maybe want to talk about on Wednesday, time allowing, but just wanted to talk at least momentarily about multiculturalism. And really the point here is that, you know, politically, this is problematic for you know, really all existing societies today, is that there is you know, there's no longer a singular culture, if there ever was one, in any nation. You know, certainly we pretended like there was one at different times in American history, but really, you know, almost all nations are facing this. And I think I kind of skipped over, you know, the idea of nation in and of itself is this kind of this cultural construct, right? The thinking about multiculturalism, though, really kind of, you know, points up how constructed the construct of nation is. And I find this interesting, the idea of how to deal with multiculturalism that Griswold brings up. And we see, you know, examples of this, you know, all around the world. So how do you deal with multiple cultures? Meaning, how do you construct a sense of the nation in the face of multiculturalism, in the face of there being different groups of people with different cultures in the country? And so one way to deal with that is suppression. which is, I mean, at its worst, it's ethnic cleansing. But we can think about what's going on with the Uyghur in China in this rubric, and it's like what they seem to be doing is trying to reprogram people. So they're putting the Uyghur into camps, taking away their Qurans, teaching them how to be good Chinese people, because the idea in China is that you suppress all. There's even a saying about this. It's like the nail that stands up will get pounded down. Like, if there's like a wooden floor and there's like a nail head sticking up, they're going to pound it down. Nobody should stand out. Everybody should be on the same level. That's how they tend to deal with this. There is denial. Just say it's a melting pot, as we used to do in America, through the 70s or 80s. We say, oh, it's America's a melting pot and there's no real multicultural problem. So, everything's fine. Everything's okay. You can marginalize, as we did with reservations. If you can take a group with a different culture and stick them off someplace wacky, then that's not an issue for your society. Of course, religious extremists in America, fall into a pretty similar bucket here. If they're off on a compound and they're not making too much noise, we're not going to worry about them. You can acknowledge and craft a pan-cultural identity or a pan-national identity, which is what they did in the USSR. They said, okay, you're Ukrainian, but there's also this Soviet identity, and then and she's way more optimistic about this than I think she might be 5 or 6 years later. We can celebrate multiculturalism as the identity, which she argues is what the US does. Certainly some official rhetoric says that, but again, as we have a president who wants to build walls, I'm increasingly doubtful about that. Okay, that's got to be all for today. I'm a little bit over here. So I will see you again on Wednesday, and somebody is presenting on Wednesday. Is that correct? Where are we here? You are?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. All right. Polish pathology. Sounds good. All right. See you then.